The protracted conflict in South Sudan is raising international concern. The United States, Britain and Norway have called on parties in the conflict to stop violating the ceasefire signed last month. The three countries, or the Troika, form a group that supported the independence of South Sudan. They've also threatened sanctions against individuals and factional groups. The ceasefire signed in Addis Ababa aims to end a 4-year civil war that has killed tens of thousands. It's also designed to allow humanitarian groups access to civilians caught in the fighting. The ceasefire is to be followed by further talks focusing on a revised power-sharing arrangement leading to a new date for polls. Well, CGTN's Daniel Reintjes is keeping tabs on this story. He joins us now with more details from Washington. Daniel, as we know, of course, the conflict in South Sudan has been going on for nearly 4 years now, but it seems that this troika is losing patience with South Sudan. What exactly has prompted this latest statement from the three countries at this time?
Well, these three countries are some of the biggest donors to humanitarian aid and development assistance for South Sudan. For example, the U.S., the largest donor, has put more than $2 billion into South Sudan since 2014. And what do we have to show for it? Continued conflict, a complete retraction of development, GDP going down, minus 15%, huge humanitarian crisis with around 40 to 45% of the population in dire need of humanitarian assistance. And it comes only days after the parties agreed to a ceasefire to enable humanitarian aid to go in and to begin stabilizing parts of the country that are in desperate need. So it's clear that the donors are focused on this, and quite frankly, they have accountability to their own countries that are providing this aid to make sure that it begins to be effective after this long protracted situation, and after they've obviously spent a lot of time and diplomatic effort to try to get these warring parties to see the bigger picture.
And as you say, of course, they are the biggest donors to South Sudan, and that's the very leverage they have. Is there a great deal of confidence that sanctions can contribute or will contribute to a final peace deal?
Well, we know that some of the large political leaders have significant assets abroad. There's been a lot of study of this from the U.S. government side and from non-governmental organizations here in Washington about the potential strategies they could employ. Don't forget also that many of the large international banks have been severely punished by the United States, the UK and others when they have violated sanctions. And so many of those banks have put in place very stringent ways in which they can monitor financial activity, international transactions and the like going forward. And also I think that the US Treasury and others have been doing work to monitor any attempts to evade sanctions. So although the sanctions tool is not a perfect one, it certainly has there certainly has been a lot of work to try to make that more effective. And it's food for thought for those leaders who do have significant assets abroad, that those assets could be threatened by further sanctions. And indeed, I think there are plenty of signals that the US and others are prepared to impose additional very targeted sanctions on individuals to focus their minds.
What's quite interesting, looking closer at the U.S. position, Daniel, was that about a year ago the Trump administration was seemingly detached from African affairs. But looking at this particular situation and indeed others, can we expect a new approach in 2018?
Well, I think that there are many parts of the administration here in Washington that are continuing to do the work that they did under the Obama administration, and doing so with a fair amount of effectiveness. And also we've heard from the US State Department that Secretary of State Rex Tillerson is preparing to go on a trip to parts of Africa sometime in the first quarter of this year. So it shows that on a government level, even up to quite high levels, there is a need to address issues of influence for the United States in Africa. The question, though, that hasn't yet been answered is the degree to which there is commitment at the very highest level, the president himself and the staff that surrounds him at the White House. It's unclear how focused they are. What we do know, though, is that they are the U.S. military, the intelligence community is very focused on some of the emerging security threats, and they will be continuing to engage on that. That, therefore, I think guarantees that there will be some level of priority on Africa in 2018, but maybe not the level that some in the African development community would like here in Washington.
We'll be keeping an eye on that. Thanks very much, Daniel Reinches, joining us live there from Washington, D.C. Well, let's get more insights and analysis on the situation in South Sudan. I'm joined here in studio by John Gachir, a journalist and analyst on South Sudan affairs. Thank you so much for joining us. As we know, of course, the civil war in South Sudan has been going on for 4 years. It's killed tens of thousands of people. In your view, why is it so difficult to come to a sustainable peace deal?
Thank you, Lindy. I think there are a number of factors that play into this, but perhaps the biggest factor is personal, individual political ambitions. But to a large extent, perhaps the regional countries have fairly vested interest and have kind of, blown hot and cold, as it were, in seeking a new political dispensation in South Sudan. And I am here talking about Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, and Sudan, for that matter. Those are the key countries that have a lot at stake. And indeed, as your colleague is talking about, the international community, through the African Union, the UN, and God knows what, the Troika, that is the U.S., the Britain, and Norway. But for me, I think the key to this is to, shall I say, rein in the vested business and political interests in the region that seem and seek to be power players through proxies in South Sudan.
You did allude to the individuals that are at the heart of this conflict in South Sudan. And indeed, of course, we know that there are factional groups that are fueling further disturbances. There's obviously now the threat of sanctions for all these individuals, all these groups. What is your view on the possible effectiveness of such a measure?
As I said earlier, and I think this has been ongoing, sanctions, as they are individual or collective, are a good tool and a good diplomatic leverage. The issue is, will they be effected? In this regard, that you could bar all this senior personnel from going to the U.S. or U.K. and stop their bank accounts or wherever, but if they could still get access into Nairobi, into Kampala, into Addis Ababa, into Khartoum, and they could even conduct their businesses via proxies and through alternative means, the sanctions are, in my view, perhaps, unless well coordinated and structured and really followed through within the countries in the region, are insufficient. Okay. Indeed, sanctions, the issue of sanctions has been on the table for the last 4 years. Indeed, perhaps, in my view, I think the sanction issue has been what I would call the you dangle it up and down, and it doesn't really affect the characters on the ground. President Salva Kiir, or Riek Machar for that matter, Riek Machar is to a large extent a guest by force of South Africa, courtesy of IGAD, and the government of South Sudan is paying for that. Indeed, through, of course, IGAD and what have you. Salva Kiir, as he is right now, he's still importing and getting weapons, a lot of things through Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, and what have you. So for me, as I say, I would like to see, indeed, sanctions that can bite.
But then beyond these sanctions that, of course, the likes of Britain, Norway, and the U.S. are considering, and as you mentioned, the particular loophole, the weakness in all of this is the role of regional players. What then, in your view, is the key role that regional players can play in all of this, or at least what other options are available to the likes of Kenya, Uganda, etc., in helping to bring a lasting solution to the South Sudan situation?
Thank you. I believe that working in tandem and in collaboration The sanctions by U.S., Britain, European Union on their own, without there being corresponding sanctions by the countries in the region, it makes it almost difficult to implement. Indeed, the countries in the region are beholden, so to speak, to all the factions, as you raised, in South Sudan, because there are tangible business, political, economic interests that flow in and out. So it is, in my view, together with the Troika, together with the UN, together, but you cannot isolate or have IGAD and the regional countries being what we call, spanner boys. They cannot be, because they are critical and key. That, for me, sanctions, unless Kenya, Uganda, Museveni, President Uhuru, Prime Minister, Miriam of Ethiopia, and Bashir. You could say anything you so wish, but for me it's a bit too late in the day, unless you bring in the regional countries to play along and call for tougher actions.
Indeed, indeed. Thank you so much, John Gachir, a journalist and analyst on South Sudan affairs, joining us here in our studio.